The rain hit the pavement like bullets, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller pieces before disappearing into the gutter. I pulled my torn jacket tighter around my shoulders, but it was useless. The water had already soaked through to my skin, mixing with the sweat of exhaustion and the bitter taste of defeat that had become my constant companion. My stomach growled so loudly that a woman walking past actually turned to look. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. The shelter had run out of food yesterday, and the soup kitchen wouldn't open until Thursday. It was only Tuesday. I stared at the restaurant in front of me through the rain-streaked window. Bella Vista. The name was written in gold letters across dark wood, elegant and expensive. Warm light spilled out onto the wet sidewalk, and I could see people inside, laughing, eating, living their lives without a care in the world. Without the gnawing hunger that had become my alarm clock, my lullaby, my constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. 6 months ago, I would have walked through those doors like I owned the place. Hell, I practically did own half the neighborhood. But that was before everything went to hell, before my world exploded in a shower of handcuffs and legal papers and accusations that still made my head spin. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, my last $20 in the world. I'd found it in the pocket of a coat someone had donated to the shelter, probably forgot it was there when they cleaned out their closet to feel good about themselves. It was enough for a meal, maybe even enough for a hot meal and a cup of coffee that would warm me up from the inside out. But as I stood there in the rain, staring at that warm, inviting restaurant, doubt crept in like ice water in my veins. What if they took one look at me and said no? What if they called the police? What if they threw me out like I was garbage? I looked down at myself. My reflection in the window told the whole story. Torn jacket held together with safety pins. Jeans with holes in the knees that weren't fashionable. They were just holes. Work boots with the sole flapping loose on the left foot, letting in water with every step. A beard that had grown wild and unkempt because razors cost money I didn't have. Hair that hadn't seen a professional cut in months. I looked like what I was. A homeless man, a bum, a statistic. But I was also hungry enough to risk the humiliation. The brass door handle was cold under my palm as I pushed my way inside. The warmth hit me immediately, and I had to stop myself from sighing with relief. The restaurant was beautiful. Soft lighting, white tablecloths, the gentle clink of silverware against expensive plates. The smell of garlic and herbs and roasted meat made my mouth water so intensely I had to swallow hard to keep from drooling. A hostess looked up from her podium, her smile freezing on her face when she saw me. She was young, maybe 22, with perfectly styled blonde hair and makeup that probably cost more than I'd spent on food in the past week. She said, her eyes darting around nervously. Can I help you? Table for one, please, said, trying to keep my voice steady and normal. Like I belonged here, like I had every right to be here. She looked me up and down, taking in every detail of my appearance. The torn jacket, the dirty jeans, the shoes that squelched with every step, leaving small puddles on her pristine floor. I'm sorry, she said, not sounding sorry at all. We're fully booked tonight. I looked around the restaurant. There were at least 6 empty tables that I could see, including a foretop right by the window that had been empty the entire time I'd been standing outside. That table there looks free, I said, pointing. Her smile became more strained. That's reserved. What about that one? I pointed to another empty table, also reserved. And that one? Sir, I already told you. I have money, I said, pulling out the $20 bill. It was damp from the rain, crumpled from being in my pocket, but it was still legal tender. I just want a meal." The hostess stared at the 20 like it was a dead rat. Around us, I could feel other diners starting to notice the commotion. Conversations were getting quieter. People were turning in their seats to look. The attention made my skin crawl, but I stood my ground. "Let me get the manager," the hostess said, her voice tight with barely concealed disgust. She disappeared into the back, leaving me standing there in the entrance like a scarecrow in a cornfield. The silence in the restaurant, deafening. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, judging every thread of my clothing, every line on my face, every indication that I didn't belong in their world. A couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, their voices just loud enough for me to catch fragments. Probably on drugs. Shouldn't let people like that in here. What if he's dangerous? I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to tell them that 6 months ago, I was probably richer than all of them combined. That I'd eaten in restaurants like this every week. That I'd tipped waiters more than they probably made in a day. That I wasn't dangerous or on drugs, or any of the things they were assuming about me based on my appearance. But I didn't say any of that. I just stood there, dripping rainwater onto their expensive floor, clutching my $20 bill like a lifeline. The manager appeared from the back of the restaurant like a storm cloud. He was a thin man in his 50s, with a salt and pepper hair slicked back, and a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His face was set and in hard lines, his eyes cold and calculating as they took in my appearance. He walked over to me with long, purposeful strides, and I could see the distaste written across his features like graffiti on a wall. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I haven't done anything wrong," I said, hating how my voice sounded, thin and desperate and defensive. "I just want to buy a meal." "This is a respectable establishment," the manager said, his voice getting louder. More people were turning to look now, their conversations stopping entirely as they watched the show. "We have standards to maintain." "Standards?" The word came out sharper than I intended. "What standards am I violating? I'm not drunk. I'm not causing trouble. I have money to pay." The manager's lip curled in disgust. "Look at yourself. Look at how you're dressed. Look at the mess you're making on our floor." He gestured at the small puddles of rainwater around my feet. "This isn't a homeless shelter. This isn't a soup kitchen. This is a fine dining establishment." The words hit me like physical blows. Around us, the restaurant had gone completely silent. Every conversation had stopped. Every fork had been set down. Every eye in the place was focused on us, watching this public humiliation unfold like it was dinner theater. "I'm not asking for charity," I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts to keep it steady. "I'm asking to exchange money for food. That's how restaurants work." "Not this restaurant," the manager said. His voice was cold, final, absolute. "Not for people like you." And then he said the words that would echo in my head for days afterward. The words that would strip away what little dignity I had left. The words that would reduce me to nothing more than my appearance, my circumstances, my failures. "Sorry, we don't serve people like you here." I froze for a second. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything around them. I felt my face burn with shame, with humiliation, with the kind of rage that comes from being treated like you're less than human. But underneath all of that was something worse. The terrible knowledge that this wasn't the first time I'd heard those words in the past 6 months. and it wouldn't be the last. Everyone turned to look at me. My clothes, my face, my shoes. I could feel their eyes cataloging every flaw, every sign of my poverty, every indication that I didn't belong in their world. The torn sleeve of my jacket, the stubble on my cheeks, the way my shoulders hunched forward like I was trying to make myself smaller, invisible, less offensive to their sensibilities. A woman in a designer dress whispered something to her husband, who nodded grimly. A young couple, at another table, pulled out their phones, probably to post about this on social media. An elderly man shook his head in apparent approval of the manager's decision. I was surrounded by people, but I had never felt more alone in my life. I nodded slowly and turned to leave, trying to keep my head up. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, walking toward that door with dignity intact, knowing that dozens of people were watching me go, probably relieved that the uncomfortable moment was over and they could go back to their expensive meals and comfortable lives. My feet squelched in my broken shoes with every step. The sound echoed in the silence like gunshots. I made it halfway, to the door before my vision started to blur, and I realized I was crying, not sobbing, not making a scene, just tears running down my cheeks like the rain outside. I reached for the door handle, my fingers shaking from cold and hunger and the overwhelming weight of my situation. In a few seconds, I'd be back out in the rain, back to wandering the streets, back to counting the hours until the next meal at a shelter or soup kitchen, back to being invisible, unwanted, less than human. Then I heard a tray crash to the floor. The sound was like an explosion in the silent restaurant. Plates shattered against the marble floor, silverware scattered in every direction, and food splattered across the expensive carpeting. The crash was so sudden, so unexpected, that several people actually jumped in their seats. I turned around to see what had happened. A waiter stood there, eyes wide, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair and the kind of earnest face that suggested he actually cared about his job. The tray he'd been carrying lay in ruins at his feet, but he didn't seem to notice. He was too busy staring at me. "Wait," he whispered, his voice barely audible. In the sudden silence, the manager spun around, furious. "David, what the hell are you doing? Clean that up immediately." But the waiter, David, wasn't listening. He took a step closer to me, squinting like he was trying to see through smoke or fog or the distortion of time itself. "Wait," he said, again, louder this time. Are you Mr. Kai Lennox?" The room went silent. Not the kind of silence we'd had before, when people were just watching a homeless man get thrown out of a restaurant. This was different. This was the silence of held breath, of minds trying to process something that didn't make sense, of a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. Even the owner came out, shaking. I saw him emerge from the back office, a short, round man with nervous eyes and sweat beading on his forehead, despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. He looked between me and David, then at the manager, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The manager's face had gone completely white. His mouth moved soundlessly for a few seconds before any words came out. "Oh, God," he finally whispered. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't..." But I held up a hand to stop him, because suddenly I didn't want his apology. I didn't want his groveling or his excuses or his desperate attempts to fix what couldn't be unfixed. I wanted to understand what had just happened. "You recognize me," I said to David, the waiter who'd dropped his tray. David nodded, his eyes still wide with shock. "Yes, sir. I served you just 3 months ago. You came in for dinner with your girlfriend. You ordered the lamb, and she had the salmon. You tipped me $100 because I told you it was my first week on the job. The memory hit me like a physical blow 3 months ago, back when I still had money, still had a penthouse, still had a girlfriend who loved me for all the wrong reasons, back when walking into a restaurant like this was as natural as breathing. You left in a black Tesla. David continued, his voice getting stronger as the memory solidified. And you said if I ever wanted to get into tech, I should look you up. You gave me your business card. I remembered. David had been nervous, eager to please, full of dreams about making it in Silicon Valley. I'd seen something of my younger self in him and decided to be generous. It had been such a small gesture to me then. $100 tip, an offhand comment about staying in touch, pocket change, and throwaway words. But to David, it had obviously meant something more. The manager was backing away from me now, his face cycling through expressions of horror, disbelief, and growing panic. "Mr. Lennox, please. There's been a terrible mistake. Let me get you our best table." "The mistake," I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet restaurant, "was thinking you could judge a man's worth by the clothes on his back. And then something beautiful happened, something that restored a tiny piece of my faith in humanity." An elderly woman at a corner table stood up. She moved slowly, using a carved wooden cane to support herself. But there was nothing frail about the way she carried herself. She had silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and she wore the kind of understated expensive clothing that screamed old money. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and they were fixed on the manager with laser-like intensity. She walked over to us, her cane tapping against the marble floor with each deliberate step. The sound echoed in the silence like a countdown timer. "Young man," she said to the manager, and her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from decades of never being ignored. "I've been coming to this restaurant for 30 years. The manager's face somehow went even whiter. "Mrs. Patterson, I can explain. Don't interrupt me," she said sharply, and he immediately shut his mouth. 30 years. My late husband proposed to me in that booth over there. She pointed with her cane to a corner booth near the window. We celebrated our anniversary here every year until he passed. I've brought my children here, my grandchildren. I've recommended this place to friends, colleagues, business associates. She paused, letting her words sink in. "And if this is how you treat people who are struggling," she continued, her voice growing colder with each word, "then you've lost my business forever. And I'll make sure everyone I know hears about what happened here tonight." The manager looked like he might faint. Mrs. Patterson was clearly someone with influence, someone whose opinion mattered in this community. Losing her business would be bad enough, but losing her recommendation would be devastating. She turned to me, and her expression softened. "I don't know who you are, son, but nobody deserves to be treated like that. Nobody." Before I could respond, something else happened that I never would have expected. Other customers began standing up. First, it was a man in a construction uniform who'd been eating alone at the bar. He was still wearing his hard hat, still covered in the dust and grime of an honest day's work. He pulled out his wallet and walked over to me. "I don't know what's going on here," he said, his voice rough but kind. "But I know what it's like to be judged by how you look. Whatever this man wants to eat, it's on me." Then a young couple at another table stood up. The woman was holding her purse, her boyfriend reaching for his jacket. "This is disgusting," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Come on, Jake. Let's find somewhere else to eat. More people began standing. A businessman in an expensive suit. A family with 2 young children. An older couple who'd been sharing a bottle of wine. One by one, they gathered their belongings and headed for the door. The manager looked around desperately as his restaurant began to empty out. Please, everyone, let's just... No, I said quietly, but my voice carried in the sudden chaos. Don't make this about money or who I used to be. Make it about basic human decency. The exodus stopped. People paused in their departure to look back at me, waiting to hear what I had to say next. I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. Some showed recognition now. They were starting to remember where they'd seen my face before. Others just looked confused, trying to piece together what was happening. A few were still, holding their phones up, recording this strange scene for posterity. And suddenly, I realized I had something to say, something that had been building up inside me for 6 months, growing stronger with every night I'd spent in a shelter, every meal I'd skipped, every time someone had looked right through me like I didn't exist. 6 months ago, I began. My voice, steady despite the emotion building in my chest. I thought I knew what poverty looked like from the outside. I wrote checks to homeless shelters and felt good about myself. I attended charity galas and gave speeches about helping the less fortunate. I believed that the system worked, that people who were struggling just needed a helping hand to get back on their feet. I paused, looking directly at the manager, who was now visibly sweating. But I never understood what it meant to be invisible. To have people look right through you like you don't exist. To be denied service not because you can't pay, but because of how you look. To be treated like you're somehow less human because you're poor. My voice cracked slightly on the last word, but I pushed through. I've slept in shelters where the staff treat people like criminals just for being poor. I've stood in line for food stamps while people whispered about welfare queens and lazy freeloaders. I've been spit on, kicked while I was sleeping, told to get a job by people who wouldn't hire me to clean their toilets. A woman near the back of the restaurant had tears in her eyes. The construction worker nodded grimly, like he understood exactly what I was talking about. So thank you, I continued, looking directly at the manager, for reminding me what I'm fighting for, because when I get through this, and I will get through this, I'm not going back to writing checks and feeling good about myself. I'm going to use everything I rebuild to make sure nobody else has to feel invisible. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of people watching a spectacle. It was the thoughtful silence of people processing something important, something that had challenged their assumptions about the world. Mrs. Patterson was the first to speak. "What's your name, son?" "Kai Lennox." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The tech entrepreneur. You were in the news." "Yeah," I said. "I was in the news." She nodded slowly, understanding passing between us without the need for explanation. She'd lived long enough to see fortunes rise and fall, to know that circumstances could change in an instant, that nobody was immune to life's cruelties. "Well, Mr. Lennox," she said, "I think you've just given everyone in this room something to think about." She turned to the manager, who was still standing there looking shell-shocked. "As for you," she said, her voice ice-cold again, "I hope you remember this moment the next time someone walks through your door looking for basic human dignity along with their meal." With that, she walked toward the exit, her cane tapping against the floor like a judge's gavel. The construction worker followed her, along with the young couple and most of the other customers who had stood up, but not everyone left. A few people sat back down, clearly wanting to see how this would play out. David, the waiter who'd recognized me, was still standing amid the wreckage of his dropped tray, staring at me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. The manager looked around at his half-empty restaurant, then back at me. His earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Mr. Lennox," he said quietly, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," I replied. "Just remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance." I turned to leave, but David stepped forward. "Mr. Lennox, wait." He looked around at the mess on the floor, then back at me. "I know this probably doesn't mean much right now, but that business card you gave me, I still have it. I've been carrying it in my wallet for 3 months, waiting for the right time to reach out." I stopped walking. "Why didn't you?" He gestured at himself. The waiter's uniform, the name tag, the obvious signs of someone still working his way up in the world. "Because I didn't think I was ready yet. I wanted to have something impressive to show you, some big idea or achievement that would make you take me seriously." A sad smile crossed my face. "David, let me tell you something I've learned recently. Impressive achievements can disappear overnight. Big ideas can crumble in an instant. But character is what matters when everything else falls apart." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pen, one of the few possessions I still had from my old life. On the back of a napkin, I wrote down the phone number for the shelter where I'd been staying. "If you're serious about getting into tech," I said, handing him the napkin, "call me in a few weeks. I might not have a company anymore, but I still have 20 years of experience and connections. And right now, I have something else that might be even more valuable." "What's that?" "Perspective." David took the napkin carefully, like it was made of gold. "Thank you, Mr. Lennox, for the original opportunity, and for this one." I nodded and turned back toward the door. The manager made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Lennox, please, let me comp your meal. Let me make this right." I stopped and turned back to face him one final time. "You want to make this right?" I asked. "Here's how. The next time someone walks in here looking like I did tonight, homeless, desperate, down on their luck, you treat them like a human being. You don't have to give them a free meal. You don't have to pretend they're something they're not. Just treat them with basic dignity and respect." I paused, letting that sink in. "Because here's what you need to understand. I got lucky tonight. I had someone who recognized me, who could vouch for my identity, who could turn this humiliation into a teaching moment. But what about all the people who don't get that lucky break? What about the people who are exactly what they appear to be? Poor, desperate, hungry, and have no hidden fortune to fall back on. Don't they deserve to be treated like human beings too?" The manager nodded slowly, and for the first time since this whole scene had started, I thought I saw genuine understanding in his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, "they do." "Then prove it. Not with words, but with actions. The next time this situation comes up, and it will come up, remember this conversation. Remember how it felt to be wrong about someone, and choose differently." With that, I walked out of the restaurant and back into the rain. But this time, I wasn't alone. Mrs. Patterson was waiting for me under the awning next door, along with the construction worker and several other customers who had walked out in solidarity. "Young man," Mrs. Patterson said as I approached, "I believe we need to continue this conversation somewhere more private." Before I could respond, the construction worker stepped forward and extended his hand. "Name's Bill Rodriguez," he said. I own a small construction company here in the city. Nothing fancy, but we do honest work." He paused, studying my face. "I don't know your whole story, Mr. Lennox, but I know what it's like to be judged by appearances. When I started my business 15 years ago, I couldn't get a loan from any bank in town because I looked like just another day laborer in work. Boots." He smiled grimly. "Turns out being underestimated can be an advantage. People don't see you coming." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "Bill's company has done excellent work on several of my properties over the years. He's a man who understands the value of character over appearances." I looked between these two strangers who had stood up for me, who had walked out of their comfortable evening to make a point about human dignity, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you get involved? You don't know me. For all you knew, I really was just some homeless man trying to cause trouble." Mrs. Patterson's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but it was anger on my behalf, not directed at me, because I've lived 83 years on this earth. She said, "And I've learned that you can judge the character of a society by how it treats its most vulnerable members. What happened in there wasn't just about you, Mr. Lennox. It was about all of us. It was about what kind of people we choose to be when we think nobody important is watching." Bill nodded in agreement. "My grandfather came to this country with nothing but the clothes on his back and a willingness to work. He faced that same kind of discrimination, that same judgment, based on appearance and accent and social class. If someone like him walked into that restaurant tonight, they would have been treated exactly like you were. But you had the power to change the narrative." Mrs. Patterson continued, "Your identity, your story, your ability to articulate what happened. It turned a simple case of discrimination into a teaching moment. The question is, what are you going to do with that power?" Standing there in the rain, surrounded by these unexpected allies, I realized that this moment was a crossroads. I could take this experience and use it as fuel for bitterness and revenge. I could retreat back into whatever remained of my old life and try to forget these past 6 months ever happened, or I could do something else entirely. "I don't know yet," I admitted. 6 hours ago, I was just trying to buy a meal. Now I feel like I'm supposed to have all the answers to problems I'm only just beginning to understand." "Nobody expects you to have all the answers," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "But you have something most people don't. You've seen both sides. You've been at the top and at the bottom, and you understand how different the world looks from each perspective." Bill checked his watch. "Listen, I know we just met, but my crew's working on a project about 6 blocks from here. Nothing fancy, just renovating some affordable housing units. But we've got a trailer on site with coffee and sandwiches. Why don't we get out of this rain and continue this conversation somewhere dry?" I looked between these two people, a wealthy socialite and a working-class contractor who had somehow found common ground in defending a stranger's dignity. 6 months ago, I would never have imagined them in the same room together, let alone working as allies. "Okay," I said. "Lead the way." As we walked through the rain-soaked streets, Mrs. Patterson filled me in on her background. She'd inherited wealth from her family's textile business, but had spent most of her adult life giving it away through carefully chosen charitable causes. Bill talked about his company's work in affordable housing, the challenges of running a small business that tried to balance profit with social responsibility. And slowly, as we walked, I began to understand that what had happened in the restaurant wasn't just a random moment of discrimination. It was a symptom of something much larger, A society that had become comfortable with inequality, that had learned to look away from suffering, that had convinced itself that poverty was a personal failing rather than a systemic problem. By the time we reached Bill's construction trailer, I had the beginning of an idea. It wasn't fully formed yet, just the seed of something that might grow into a solution. But for the first time in 6 months, I felt like I had a purpose beyond just surviving until tomorrow. As Bill unlocked the trailer and gestured for us to come inside, I realized that this night, this terrible, humiliating, transformative night, might turn out to be the most important night of my life. Not because of what I'd lost, but because of what I'd found.